In the Roman Republic, religion was not a private refuge or a sphere of personal salvation. It was a public institution woven directly into the political and legal structures of the state. The sacred and the civic were not merely adjacent. They were mutually constitutive. The early Romans, deeply practical in disposition, regarded the gods not as distant metaphysical forces, but as participants in the life of the residential publica, protectors of fields, contracts, assemblies, and treaties. Ritual precision, not personal devotion, formed the foundation of religious life. Every sacrifice, augury, and lustratio had to be executed with exacting care, lest the ritual be declared invalid and repeated. The gods of Rome were not abstract moral arbiters, but powers who required formal engagement. They were, as Cicero later framed them, guardians of institutional continuity. Divine favor was not automatic. It had to be secured, consulted, and reaffirmed at every significant political or military act. This religiosity, however, was inherently conservative. The Roman religious system, codified in the books of the pontifices and governed by the authority of the priestly colleges, served above all to preserve order. It reinforced traditional hierarchies, sanctioned magistracies, and marked the calendar with civic and agricultural rites. The Roman paterfamilias acted as priest within the household, while the consul, elected by the people, sacrificed before battle. From domestic hearth to battlefield altar, Roman religion structured space and time around the supremacy of the Roman state. Foreign gods and rites, especially those of the Etruscans and Greeks, had long been integrated through a controlled process of reinterpretation. Rome did not reject foreign cults outright, but adapted them, often by aligning them with existing Roman deities or functions. What mattered was not the origin of a god, but its utility in reinforcing civic cohesion. In this way, the Sibylline oracles, imported from the Greek world, were domesticated into Roman religious policy. By the late Republic, however, the stability of this system was strained. Conquest brought with it a proliferation of new cults and mystical rites, challenging the ritual orthodoxy of traditional religion. Yet the core structure persisted. Roman religion remained less a matter of belief and more an instrument of mos maiorum, the ancestral custom that bound the Republic together. Its role was not to promise transcendence, but to regulate the relationship between human action and divine sanction, ensuring that Rome remained, as Livy later wrote, respected by the gods as much as by men. In the Roman Republic, religion was not merely a spiritual domain. It was an extension of statecraft. The authority to interpret the will of the gods, to declare auspices favorable or otherwise, and to regulate sacred law was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The priesthoods, the pontifices, augurs, and decemviri sacris faciundis were not separate from the ruling class. They were embedded within it. Leading statesmen, consuls, and censors held religious offices concurrently with political command, ensuring that divine sanction was inseparable from senatorial power. This fusion of religion and politics was not incidental. It provided a mechanism by which the elite could legitimize action or inaction. Before laws were passed, before battles commenced, before elections were confirmed, the auspices were consulted. A magistrate could suspend an assembly by claiming unfavorable signs, a maneuver that, while religious in form, was transparently political in function. The manipulation of omens became a regular tactic in the contest for office and influence. Mommsen is unequivocal in his depiction of this system. It was formalistic, procedural, and designed to reinforce authority rather than to inspire belief. The gods were invoked to preserve the hierarchy of the state. Religion was not a realm of theological speculation, but of ritual control. When new cults were introduced, often after consultation with the Sibylline books, their adoption was administered by state decree, their ceremonies aligned with Roman religious norms, and their priesthoods drawn from established families. Yet this very system, so reliant on form and precedent, was vulnerable to cynicism. As Rome expanded and wealth concentrated, The religious offices became prizes in a broader economy of prestige. The augurate or pontificate, once a solemn responsibility, could be sought for its political leverage or social distinction. Religious observance continued, but belief was increasingly perfunctory. The gods were honored, but their presence had become ceremonial, their authority subordinate to the calculus of power. This is the paradox Mommsen identifies. Roman religion, though ever present in public life, was hollowed out from within. Its rituals were maintained with obsessive care, but the sincerity that once animated them had ebbed. What remained was a system of religious legitimacy, functioning, effective, but increasingly devoid of moral force. Religion still governed politics, but it no longer governed conduct. By the late Republic, the outward piety of Rome concealed a growing estrangement between the elite and the religious traditions they once upheld. The aristocracy, increasingly immersed in the luxuries of empire, imported silks, Greek art, endless feasting, treated the ancestral rites not as sacred obligations, but as instruments of political decorum. Public rituals continued, sacrifices were performed, temples were restored. But beneath the surface, there was a perceptible shift. Religion had become a performance, and its participants, actors before an audience that no longer believed. Mommsen identifies this as a critical marker of moral decline. The Roman elite no longer embodied the virtues they publicly invoked. The mos maiorum, once the moral and religious backbone of the Republic, was reduced to rhetoric. Senators spoke of discipline, modesty, and ancestral piety, but their private conduct was shaped by avarice and ambition. The temples stood intact, yet the gods they housed no longer restrained conduct. Superstition filled the vacuum left by faith. Omens interpreted for personal gain, prodigies multiplied to manipulate public fear, and foreign cults adopted for their novelty or sensual allure. This decay was not limited to private life. It infected the Republic's institutions. Laws were passed to curb extravagance, to reinforce traditional conduct, to limit displays of excessive wealth, and they were ignored with regularity. Satirists and moralists emerged in response, lamenting a Rome lost to gold, lost to the East, lost to its own appetites. In every respect, the outward form of Roman religion remained intact, but its inner restraint had eroded. Mommsen does not romanticize the past, but he draws a sharp contrast between the old civic religion, stoic, restrained, rooted in duty, and the theatrical religiosity of the late Republic. What once bound citizens together in shared ritual and belief had become a stage for elite self-display. The gods had not been banished, but they had been displaced, first by wealth, then by indifference. Religion endured in language and law, but no longer in conduct. Rome continued to honor its sacred rites, but the sacred had become subordinate to the spectacle. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, it did not merely annex territories. It absorbed cultures, pantheons, and ritual forms. With each conquest came a new wave of deities, cults, and religious ideas, many of them foreign to the traditional Roman mind, but deeply resonant in a society shaken by political instability and spiritual fatigue. The late Republic saw a marked influx of Oriental and mystery religions. The worship of Cybele from Phrygia, Isis from Egypt, and Dionysus from the Greek world, all offering what traditional Roman religion did not: emotional immediacy, personal salvation, and ecstatic communion with the divine. These cults often arrived first as private devotions, introduced by slaves, traders, and provincial immigrants, but they soon found adherents among the Roman poor, the displaced, and even segments of the elite seeking refuge from civic decay. The rituals, processions, secret initiations, symbolic rebirths, offered intensity over orthodoxy, experience over form. Where Roman state religion emphasized collective stability and formal rite, these imported cults emphasized transformation, mystery, and often suffering followed by renewal. Yet their spread did not go uncontested. Conservative Roman authorities viewed such cults with suspicion, sometimes bordering on hostility. Their rites were seen as subversive, their moral codes foreign, their appeal disruptive to Roman order. The Senate periodically expelled foreign priests, suppressed rites, and reasserted the authority of the traditional colleges. But repression was only partially effective. The old civic religion, hollowed by formalism and elite hypocrisy, no longer satisfied the inner life of the populace. Mommsen frames this religious pluralism not simply as a theological shift, but as a sign of institutional exhaustion. The Republic, unable to inspire belief in its own civic gods, could not prevent its subjects from seeking the sacred elsewhere. The appeal of foreign cults grew not because of their exoticism alone, but because they addressed something Roman religion had long ceased to offer: personal meaning in an unstable world. What emerged, then, was a fractured religious landscape. The old rites continued, sponsored by magistrates, timed with festivals, carried out in the forum, but around them, often in private houses or underground shrines, newer forms of worship flourished. Rome remained formally pious, yet beneath the ceremonies, faith was no longer unified. Religious life had become diverse, fragmented, and increasingly inward, mirroring the condition of the Republic itself. In Roman society, manners, mores, were not a matter of etiquette in the modern sense, but a reflection of moral hierarchy, ancestral authority, and social distinction. They were the outward expression of internal order, a visible manifestation of Rome's civic values. Clothing, speech, posture, restraint and gesture, even the pace of one's walk. Each detail was laden with symbolic weight. To dress simply was to honor the virtues of the Republic. To speak modestly was to respect the dignity of office and lineage. Yet as wealth flowed into Rome from conquest and provinces, these markers of Romanitas began to erode. Eastern ornaments, Greek refinement, silken garments, elaborate banquets, all of it became status currency among the elite. Simplicity, once esteemed, was replaced by ostentation. The toga, formerly a mark of citizenship and gravity, became cumbersome and was often avoided in favor of foreign robes and embroidered tunics. The shift was not merely aesthetic, it signaled a transformation in values. Mommsen charts this decline with precision. He notes that the aristocracy, once defined by self-discipline and civic austerity, increasingly adopted the habitus of Hellenistic courts. The Roman noble no longer appeared as the stern vir militaris, but as the cultivated host, the literary patron, the connoisseur of Greek sculpture and Alexandrian perfume. Manners ceased to serve the Republic, they now served the self. This cultural softening was accompanied by a weakening of the old codes. The traditional respect for seniority, office, and gender roles became subject to ridicule and satire, and violated in private conduct. The social behaviors that once underpinned Republican cohesion, sobriety, marital fidelity, frugality, lost their hold on the elite. In their place arose a performative urbanity, refined language masking vulgar motives, ceremonious courtesy concealing political aggression. What persisted was form without substance. Public life retained its outward decorum, but it no longer reflected internal restraint. Manners became masks. They no longer communicated virtue. They obscured its absence. Mommsen's critique is subtle yet damning. The collapse of Roman mores was not a matter of changing fashion, but the visible symptom of a deeper corrosion, a ruling class that had abandoned its ancestral model while pretending still to embody it. In this hypocrisy of manners, one glimpses the Republic's moral exhaustion. Chapter 13 of Mommsen's History of Rome represents a marked shift in his narrative method, moving from the institutional and military structures that defined earlier chapters to an inquiry into the cultural forces underpinning Rome's political life. The subject is not legislation or conquest, but the moral atmosphere in which those events unfolded. Faith and manners functions as a cultural diagnosis, not a digression, but a core argument about the inner conditions that made the Republic vulnerable to collapse. Mommsen's treatment reflects the intellectual currents of his time. Writing in the 19th century, he draws from both classical moralism and modern historical analysis. He places decline not only in material terms, loss of land, rise of capital, but also in the erosion of belief, the transformation of conduct, and the fragmentation of shared values. His voice echoes that of Sallust and Livy, but with the critical apparatus of a modern historian. For Mommsen, Rome does not fall because of external enemies or administrative failure. It falters because its citizens cease to believe in the forms they continue to enact. Modern scholarship has complicated some of these claims. Where Mommsen sees religious decline, later historians have pointed to religious pluralism and the dynamic integration of foreign cults. The spread of Eastern deities, once viewed as a symptom of decay, is now often read as evidence of Rome's cultural permeability and the social creativity of its urban population. The so-called decline in manners has similarly been reevaluated, not as pure decadence, but as part of a broader negotiation between old patrician models and the cosmopolitan realities of empire. Yet Mommsen's core insight, that public ritual and private conviction had become disjoined, remains influential. He presents religion not as superstition or folklore, but as a form of civic knowledge, a means by which Romans once understood their place in the cosmos, the state, and society. Its degradation, in his view, was not merely theological, it was constitutional. The loss of shared forms, whether sacred or social, rendered the Republic's institutions brittle and performative. This interpretation aligns Mommsen with the broader tradition of moral historiography, the idea that cultures decline when their elites cease to embody the virtues they claim to defend. In that light, Chapter 13 does not sit outside the political narrative, it completes it. Faith and manners were not parallel to the Republic's crisis. They were its most intimate expression.